Alright, so today is all about firewalls, physical security, and risk. So the first thing we're going to talk about is going through the firewalls. A lot of this is review, so there's not really a ton of new material introduced here. It goes a little bit more in depth in a few topics, but a lot of this is stuff we've covered. And if you think back to the lab, we've worked on firewalls. We've gone through the different components and seen what they can do. Now, hopefully next time we have lab, we'll have everything VLANed and subnetted off, and hopefully you'll also have a unique install of pfSense. So that way you can make whatever changes, you blow it up, you fix it. Now, if you blow it up badly enough, we can always revert stuff back to factory settings, reinstall pfSense, whatever we need to do. But that's what we're talking about today, is firewalls. A little bit about security, but mostly it's just about firewalls, various technologies associated with them. So, in general, if we back up at very high level, primary purpose of a firewall is to protect a trusted network from an untrusted network. So in general, we're talking about an untrusted network, we're talking about the internet. It doesn't have to be the internet, though. Another primary component, of course, is the demilitarized zone. So allowing public-facing servers to have some degree of protection associated with them. That's certainly one thing that they do as well. You can run these, of course, on a router. You could also have a separate appliance. You could have a software. Lots of different types of firewall. But at the general level, they tell which traffic can be allowed on the private network, which traffic can be allowed on the public network, and handle demilitarized zones. Does that make sense? Okay. So, two major types. You've got a network-based. That's what you should probably be using primarily to protect your organization, because if you have something centralized, it's a lot easier to manage than if you have something completely asynchronized. So network-based, it's going to be some sort of appliance. Could be a server, could be a dedicated appliance, could be something on your router. Most of the time, I would say a dedicated appliance or even a server would be a much better approach than something on a router, because why on earth would you have it running on your router? You're trying to save a couple $1,000 bucks? Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Putting a lot more overhead on stuff, it's just not the best approach in my opinion. Does anyone disagree? It's okay to disagree. Let's say that you are an individual, and let's say that you have a IPv4 address that's public address, and using that. Do you need to worry about a dedicated hardware firewall on your home network? Probably not. Okay. You might use a host base. So host base is going to be where you have firewall rules set on an individual machine. Now, is it best practice to use some combination of these two? Absolutely. But in general, you want to rely a lot more on your network-based firewall. Okay, access control lists. We've talked about these before. I'm not going to go too much into them. But basically, it's just going to be sort of the rules of the firewall. It's going to determine what hosts are allowed through, what are not. In more modern firewalls, it's not just about the host. It's about the traffic. What type of traffic are they passing? So you got standard ACL. It's more like the old school access control list, where it filters pretty much purely on the source IP. That's obviously not a perfect approach because, well, many reasons. Better approach would be extended ACL, where you're not just looking at the source IP, you're looking at things like the port and the protocol. So this is going to be more of like an application or next generation firewall, whereas standard ACL is going to be what we have in a network layer firewall. So, it's basically the application aware and the next generation firewall, they're going to support source IP as well. So in 2021, is there a reason to use a network layer firewall as opposed to an application layer firewall? I can't think of a reason. Doesn't mean there's not one, but I'm kind of the opinion, why settle for mediocre when you can get not mediocre? You know what I mean? Like, the cost is not substantially different. You could also make an argument this is not really a practical difference. What I mean by that is equipment doesn't necessarily make the distinction between application aware and network layer. So, one piece of equipment, maybe it'll support both. Again, it's not something I would get caught up in. I would just make sure that I'm buying equipment that does reasonable functionality. Okay, so port security. So we talked about a bunch of different TCP and UDP ports. And, the first basic part of security, disable the ones you're not using. Okay, so let's say, for whatever reason, you're never going to use port 443 on a particular, let's say subnet, because it doesn't make sense to not use it on a network at all. Let's say you got a subnet that's not going to be using port 443. Disable it. There's a lot of ports, and probably want to disable the ones you're not using. Now, is that going to be foolproof security, just disabling ports? No, of course it won't. Okay, so when you're talking about ports, that's part of it. It's not the whole thing. You could get in on a different port. You could use obfuscation. You could use tunneling. Lots of different ways to fool a port that's banned, or blocked, I should say. Okay, another big part of this, make sure your firmwares are up to date. Okay, if your firmwares aren't up to date, it could mean there's vulnerabilities that are known vulnerabilities that you haven't patched against. Okay, so that's pretty self-explanatory. Deep packet inspection is another big part of this. Now, obviously, for deep packet inspection, you're going to have to use an application layer or next-gen firewall. Okay, but like I said, it's basically a marketing term. So what you're doing is you're taking a look at each packet, looking at the protocols it says it's using, and you're making sure that the packet reflects that. In some cases, this may break encryption, but that's what you want on your internal network. For example, let's say you have TLS encryption. You could break it to ensure that it's going where it says it's going. That's something you could do, and I'm not going to get into the debate if it's a good thing or bad thing, but just understand it's certainly quite easily possible, and you, of course, would have whatever firewall or whatever device is doing it. I shouldn't limit it to firewall. You would have it be acting as a certificate authority. So it would get the certificates from the firewall, and that's how it would be able to break it. Does that make sense? So, good thing to do. Well, let me rephrase that. Can be a good thing to do. Deep packet inspection is always a good thing to do, but in terms of breaking TLS, that's more of a personal decision, and really a decision for whatever company you're working for. You could also choose to use MAC filtering rules. So for instance, let's say you have a server and it has a handful of NICs on it. Typically a server is going to have at least 2 NICs, maybe 3 or 4. Probably a little bit more common, but most servers are going to have at least 2. So each of those NICs have what? Something that's unique to them. What is it? A MAC address. So if you know that those devices are for whatever servers, you may apply special rules based upon the MACs. I don't recommend using that exclusively for several reasons. Number one, can you spoof a MAC address fairly easily? Yes. Number two, if you have a bunch of servers, let's say a lot of the servers are using virtualization. It can get a little bit messy. You're talking about multiple NICs and then possibly virtual NICs. Gets a little bit messy. Number three, you got a bunch of servers. Do you want to have, hundreds or maybe even thousands of MAC addresses that you're doing stuff with? I don't know about you, that doesn't sound like a fun job, does it? So I think there are better ways to rely upon than MAC address filtering, but you make up your own decisions. I'm not saying there's a right or wrong approach. Application, we talked about this. Network is OG. Okay, you guys know OG? Okay, so is OG the GOAT? Probably not the GOAT. Okay, stateless, even worse. Stateful's a little bit better. It's able to look at a lot more information. But realistically, 2021, there's no real reason why you would prefer a network layer firewall. Okay, it's just not going to be very robust. It's not going to give you a lot of management options. I'm not even really sure you could buy one, to be honest. I think pretty much anything past 5 years, definitely, but probably 10, maybe even 15. It's going to be layer 7. It's going to be application aware. So not just looking at the IP addresses, looking at a lot more, doing deep packet inspection. So obviously that's going to be a lot better. Does that make sense? So the book talks about network layer firewalls being faster. I wouldn't say they're faster inherently. Okay. Say you have a device with 800 megahertz. Okay. And let's say you have a device with 3 gigahertz. Okay. So is this inherently faster or slower than this? Well, I haven't told you what the IPC is, have I? So assuming they have the same IPC, you would assume the 3 gigahertz device is going to be faster, right? Let's say this is a network layer. Firewall. Let's say this is next generation firewall. Okay. Now which one is probably going to be faster? More than likely this guy. Now, if I made this, say, and I'm estimating these, let's say I made it 2.8 gigahertz. Okay. 2.8 gigahertz versus 3, this one might be a little bit faster. But you see, it depends on the speed of the individual parts. Okay. You can't say next generation is always slower. You could say with the same processing abilities, it takes more processing to do layer 7 or next generation firewall. But it's not really fair to say that network is faster, because most of the time you're going to have slower hardware on devices that do less. That's a general rule of thumb. Okay, go in the lab and take a look at the 2 types of switches we have in there. Okay, we have one type of switch that's, right around 7 years old. Got another type of switch in there that's right around 20 years old. Okay? So, do those 2 things, at the basic level, do they have the same functions? Yeah, basically. Do they support all of the same protocols? No. But, for the most part, they do the same basic stuff. Obviously, the newer switch is going to support a little bit more robust and newer standards, but, by and large, they do the same thing. If I said that the newer one is inherently faster, that'd be a fallacious statement. Okay, I wouldn't say anything that ridiculous. I would never ask an exam question, which one of these 2 is faster? Okay, does that make sense? Because there's not nearly enough information to answer that question. I could answer which one takes more processing power, and that'd be a fair question, wouldn't it? Because that's obviously going to be layer 7 takes more. But that's probably more than I should have said there. So scanning services. Obviously, a big part of modern firewalls is doing basic scanning. And this scanning is just a multitude of different things you can do. So search for malware. Okay, so you're going to malware domains. That's going to be an issue. You're going to have patterns consistent with malware. For instance, let's say a device is infected with a botnet. Okay, it's going to have very distinct patterns associated with it, would it not? Okay, it certainly would. So if you have a decent firewall, it should detect that, tell you which user, tell you which device, and possibly even automatically disable its network connection. Something as a botnet, that's probably a good thing to do, is it not? Temporarily disable it, go find the device, figure out what's going on with it, possibly isolate it, do whatever you need to. Put it inside a virtual environment and see what happens. But you'd want to investigate that, certainly. So, malware is certainly something we can easily detect. Phishing. So let's say someone gets an email and it goes to a phishing website. Well, there's a couple different ways we can handle things. So if it's behavioral based, we may recognize that, but that's pretty difficult to do with websites. Most of the time, that's going to be based on a dynamic list that's updated pretty rapidly. But, let's face it, is it very difficult to copy a web page and have a phishing site? It's not a difficult thing at all, is it? So it's kind of like a cat and mouse game where it's going to be somewhat of a delay. Maybe the delay is 30 minutes. Maybe the delay is a day. It really depends. And the good thing is on modern firewalls, you can update these lists pretty regularly. Okay. So anyone here is a pie hole. So it's not really a firewall, but it's a DNS filter. Okay, so you can set on the pie hole how often, or how frequently rather, you update the list, can you not? And most people leave it at 24 hours. Okay, now that's only looking at DNS. So let's say that there were an application that, or let's say a malicious application, some malware, that had hard-coded IP addresses into it. Is your pie hole going to do anything to protect against that? I'm not going to do a single thing. Why not? Well, pretty obvious, because it's not going to go through DNS if you already have the IP address, is it? So certainly keep that in mind. That's kind of a tangent. Didn't mean to get off on that. Content. Okay. Let's face it. In a workforce, there's content that probably is not appropriate for work. For instance, let's say your work bans social media for most people. Could be seen as a time waster. I don't know. I'm trying to think what classes you all take. You all take an ethics class? Okay. So in your ethics class, you might have mentioned time theft. You might have mentioned, stuff like cyber loafing. Well, organizations can easily prevent that by using stuff like content filtering. So maybe they ban social networks on their corporate network. Maybe they ban, and they could ban that for a lot of reasons. Time wasting. Maybe they disagree with the policies of whatever social media they're talking about. Maybe they don't want to have the security risk of people posting stuff. Whatever. Lots of different reasons why you may choose to ban certain types of content. The book talks about adult content. I don't think I need to go into too many details about that. But obviously, a corporate network should probably have that banned, should they not? Okay. That'd be a huge HR issue, obviously. I don't need to go into details. And beyond that, just having maybe some other types of content you don't like. So, whatever types of content that may be for your organization, it's certainly possible to ban it. Okay. Now, I'm not saying that you should. I'm not saying what you should or should not ban. I'm just saying you can ban pretty much anything. Okay, so let's say you were a K-12 school, or let's say you were a public library. Okay, you're going to be subject to a lot of regulations with your network because you have people under the age of 18 using the network. So, big regulation I'm talking about here is CIPA. Okay, so I think that stands for Child Internet Protection Act, or something like that. Not to be confused with COPPA. COPPA's different regulations. So CIPA says you have to have a basic content filter to filter out adult content, because they don't want minors to be exposed to adult content. So, be aware of whatever regulations you're subject to. For the most part, that's the only major one that deals with content. You can make an argument that you should probably block stuff like phishing and malware links, and you probably should, regardless of what industry, because it's not going to help your organization. It can only harm it. Is that right? Now, could be some exceptions to that. Let's say you are doing malware research. So, if you're doing malware research, obviously you'd want to have a separate firewall group to allow your malware research to work. If you don't have that, then you're not going to be getting any malware, are you? So, but use common sense. I mean, this is not very difficult stuff. You can certainly filter out mail. I would probably make an argument that a firewall is not necessarily the best place to do this. I think a much better place would be your mail server. Set the policies on that. But hey, do things how you want. Web content, we talked about that. Many other protocols as well. I mean, pretty much anything going across the network, you can filter with scanning services. Okay? Let's say you didn't want to allow remote access. Can you filter out things like TeamViewer and LogMeIn? Yeah, pretty easily. You can easily block that. So pretty much anything you can imagine, you can block if you choose to. Whether or not you choose to is determined by a lot of different things. So for this, of course, I can use signatures. That's certainly one way. Signatures can be things like malware, blocking that. Most of the time it's going to be a big content list, and like I said, you can have millions of records. A lot of those. So just kind of keep that in mind. Context. So that's going to be where it's getting into stuff like DPI, behavior. So seeing if there's abnormal behavior, however it's configured. Behavioral analysis. It's got some substantial problems to think about. So you got your type 1 and type 2 errors. It's going to have both high type 1 and type 2 errors. But it's very possible behavioral analysis could detect stuff like a zero-day exploit. Could detect stuff like a brand new piece of malware. Whereas signature-based and list-based is not going to detect any of that, will it? So, I would suggest using it in combination, but just understand that you're going to have a lot of type 1 and type 2 errors with behavioral analysis. All right. So zones. Basically, zones are another term for firewall segments. So it's like a subnet, but not really. It's more like a different group of policies that you're applying to different users, different whatever. And in general, this is concerned with things like trusted groups and untrusted groups. So if you read the book, it was going through settings in Internet Explorer, and I'm like, what does this have to do with anything? Like, I didn't quite understand all that, but whatever. So intrusion detection systems are going to be all about looking at a system and determining if it's been abused. Of course, we're talking about abused. We're talking about, is it attacked? Obviously not physically, but there could be some physical damage. So it's about 7 primary layers of security. The outermost, of course, being physical. So if someone were to walk up to a system with, let's say, a sledgehammer, okay, and they were to beat the system, and it were using mechanical spinning hard drive, that could be some physical abuse, could it not? But is that very likely to happen? Not if you're a competent organization, okay? You shouldn't have people walking around with sledgehammers unless they're doing demolition, okay? Lots of different reasons for that. I'll leave it up to you for whatever your organization wants to do. Okay, so the whole purpose of this is to detect abuse. And basically, there's 2 different types of it. Okay, we got one that's going to be signature-based, and we got one that's going to be behavior-based. So misuse detection is going to be based on signatures, existing attacks, seeing what has been done before, and then forming signatures based off of that. Basically like a virus scanner. You download a signature database. It's basically the same principle here. Anomaly detection is going to be behavioral-based. And with most behavioral-based systems, it's going to get better over time. It's going to learn the specifics of that system. So in general, an IDS is going to be for a specific system, in general. And, so let's say you had a transaction server. You run an IDS on it and see if someone is adjusting transactions that they shouldn't be. Does that make sense? So here's an example here. We have our IDS. It's using an attack signature database here. So what type of IDS is this? It's using signatures. What type is it? Misuse. That's exactly right. It's going to be signature-based. Okay? And it can do a lot of different things. If it's going to be passive, it's obviously going to be pure IDS. You'd, of course, log it. Okay, so you would have some log. And in general, you should never disable logging. Let me rephrase that. If you're doing legitimate things, you shouldn't disable logging. If you're doing things illegitimately, it's probably not a good idea to log that, is it? Okay? So, talk about things like discovery. Okay, let's say your company gets sued, and let's say they're doing things that aren't entirely legal. If you're logging things and it's in discovery, that can be subpoenaed, can it not? Yeah, pretty easily. So I would say logging's a good thing most of the time. Now, I'm not suggesting you do anything illegal or unethical, but if you were to do so anyway, you might as well do it smartly, right? Okay? I never suggest anything unethical, though. Okay? Notification. So notification for an IDS can be annoying. You may want to get a summary of them, maybe every day, maybe every couple hours. You can even have it set to give you automated phone call. I don't know why anyone would do that, but you could. Okay. And then, of course, shunning would be where it determines what action it takes. Okay. It's going to be active. It's going to be more of like an IPS. Okay. It's going to actually prevent the intrusion. So this is where you can do things like change the network configuration. So maybe you want to disable an entire user. You can do that. Maybe you want to disable an IP address. You can do that. Maybe you want to temporarily disable something. Lots of different options. You can configure it however you see best fit. I'm not here to tell you how you should configure it, but use some common sense. The book talks about you could disable something for 60 seconds. I think it said like disable a port for 60 seconds to stop an attack. That's pretty ridiculous, isn't it? Okay, well, what's going to happen 61 seconds later? Are they not going to keep trying? They're probably going to keep trying. Okay, I think that's a really ridiculous suggestion. But, you may think that's a great suggestion. Again, my opinion is that's not the way to handle an IPS. You can terminate sessions. That's a much better approach. So you got a session that's doing malicious things, terminate it. Okay? Ban the user. Let's say you have a user who is breaking company policy. Maybe they're doing file sharing at work. Temporarily ban their account, refer the matter to HR, document everything, and maybe make them go through some training before they get their access restored. Maybe HR wants to go ahead and terminate the person. Whatever the case is, terminating the session is always a good thing. Okay, and then lastly, things like deceiving the attacker. They can certainly do that. It's where they'd spoof certain things and just make them think that they accessed something they didn't. Lots of different ways you can do this. It's a very broad approach. Any questions about IDS and IPS? So again, IDS is going to be a passive approach, primarily to log. IPS, of course, is also going to log, but it's going to actively try to stop threats. Does that make sense? Okay, so host-based IDS, also known as HIDS, it's going to be where you're having it on a particular system. It's a very common approach, and you have a very important server, something that's going to be having lots of important data going across it. You want to make sure it's not compromised. You want to make sure to be able to detect what information was compromised, if information is compromised. It's going to be what you're going to use here. And basically, the whole purpose of this is to determine if there's any sort of anomalies. So for example, let's say you got a database. And let's say someone runs something like this. Okay? So that can be an anomaly. Hopefully. You shouldn't be selecting everything from the customer table all the time, now should you? That should be a pretty strange occurrence. Let's say we got a social security number inside of our customer table. Okay, is that something people could try to get? Yeah. Would that be a problem for us if this were run? Could be. So that's why you'd have this on a host-based system. Does that make sense? So that's one basic example. There's many things it can do. So understand it's looking for anomalies. Okay, some different vulnerabilities, scanners. So, there's many more. Next semester in the security class, we'll do a lot of labs with open source stuff, of course. You got Nessus. It's going to be used proprietary. It's going to provide a lot of basic functionality with stuff like port scanning, looking at vulnerabilities. The vulnerabilities can expand to many different things. They're not limited to just, technological things like using a password multiple times, using the default password. Lots of different things you can do there. Nmap, we'll be using that next semester. And basically, it's where you're going to have a tool that's going to allow you to scan the ports on a network, see what's active, see what is rejected, and give you a good idea of what software are on each of the hosts they can get to. And in addition, you can even see what patches it has. So, with that information, you can do various vulnerabilities based on if it's missing critical patches that have known exploits associated with them. Okay, unified threat management. It's basically a fancy way of saying putting everything into one system. So you got your malware, you got your mail protection, you have your firewall, just a bunch of other things, maybe even password management into one single thing called Unified Threat Management. All right, this is what the chapter is called, and it's just a tiny fraction of the book, or a tiny fraction of the chapter. Physical security. So if you don't have physical security, I would make an argument you don't have any security at all. Okay, because at minimum, if you have a server running on a server rack, okay, I got our happy little server here, and the server rack is in the lobby, okay, and the lobby doesn't have any cameras, nor does it have any, no one's in the lobby, okay, right by the front door to your organization. Is that a good place for a server rack? Why not? Then why is it a bad place for a server rack? Yeah, exactly. So, people could certainly damage it. Could they just walk away with the whole server? Now, if you have encryption on the server, that may not be a huge concern to you, and you should certainly encrypt servers, but, it's still going to cause a access problem, okay? It's not just about can they get the data. It's not just about confidentiality. It's also about availability, okay? So at minimum, it's going to be an availability problem. Worst case, it could be a problem with everything. If you got a server just out in the open like that, could someone potentially come by and insert a flash drive with some malicious scripts on it? Pretty easily. Could they hook up a keyboard and mouse and execute them? Maybe. I'd say it's possible. So that could even be an issue with integrity. So, just one basic example there. So, in general, talking about security, we like walls. Okay, we like physical barriers that prevent people from entry. Okay, have a fence around the perimeter of a property. Okay, if you don't have a fence around the perimeter of a property, you don't have no trespassing. Can someone just walk in? It's possible. Now, obviously, fences aren't foolproof. I'm not saying that they're going to be the end-all be. Not a single thing up here is the only solution you would have. It's about a layered approach. Okay, but certainly fences, walls, using doors with locks, of course, can be a very important part of any security plan. Okay, so with locks, I would say it's very important that they're not a physical key, or that that's at least not the only lock that you have on the door. Okay, let's use an example. Let's say you have 200,000 employees working for a firm. Okay, every single day, someone's getting fired for something. Okay, so that means that if you have a physical lock and you want to have decent security, what should you be doing every single day? Exactly. Is that feasible to do with physical locks? Not even close. Okay? So you'd want to have things that are done electronically, be it a card. Personally, I like the approach of having a multi-factor door. Okay, so you have like a card or you have a key, and then you input a code or you use a fingerprint. Now, of course, biometrics are another can of worms because, let's face it, a lot of people don't want their employer to have access to their biometric data. That's a good thing, okay? Imagine if your employer got access to your DNA. Could that be a thing that could be abused? Yeah. For obvious reasons, okay? Let's say that they don't want to hire people who have alleles associated with things like ALS or things like Alzheimer's, okay? Could they discriminate if they have your DNA? It's possible. So again, I think biometrics, while they can be good, there's some obvious downsides to them as well. But a good old password and physical token, that's going to certainly help your security. So you can also use electronic locks, pretty common in a lot of environments to have an electronic door lock where you have to push a button to exit. Obviously, it's using electromagnetic. Now, what's the downside with those? Okay, there's an obvious downside. What if you lose power? Okay, and it's an electromagnetic lock. If you don't have power, how is it going to lock the door? Well, there's going to be some sort of battery backup, but you're going to have the spell size built in to ensure that you're not going to have just a door wide open during extended period of outage. Does that make sense? That's why I say multiple locks could be a good thing. Man traps. Any Rust players in here? Okay. Call this an airlock in Rust, don't we? Okay. So, whole idea is when you're base building in Rust, okay, what you want to do is you always want to have at least 2 doors. Okay, because in Rust, doors are quite weak, aren't they? So even like a sheet metal door or like an armored door, okay, the idea is that you have to get through multiple doors because the walls are going to be, depends on materials, but in general, they're going to be about 2 to 4 times as strong as the doors. Okay, but you got to have doors because if you don't have a door, you're not going to be getting in and out, are you? So, that's basically the general principle here as well. Okay, to have multiple doors, so if someone walks in behind you, they're not into your organization, they're in the lobby. Okay, does that make sense? That's called a man trap. Not to be confused with a manhole. That's a different thing, isn't it? Okay. Detection. So, obviously, another part of this is, detecting what happens. So do that with things like alarms. So you have an alarm system for the organization, or whatever building you're in, probably. And you can put that, of course, on special zones. So, for instance, maybe you have one part that's open 24/7, one part that's open to most employees, and then you have another part that's a server room. So it's quite common for a server room to have a separate building alarm. You enter a server room, input the code. You don't input the code in 30 seconds, maybe it triggers an alarm. Another reason for that is because a lot of times those alarms are tied into other things associated with data center security. Or I wouldn't say security, but physical well-being. So for instance, you have like heat sensors. It gets above a certain temperature, trigger an alarm. You'd have things like humidity sensors. It gets above a certain threshold, usually around 75–80%. You'd want someone to go check that out. Freezing sensors. Not really a huge problem for the server equipment themselves, but freezing sensors are a good thing because if your building is freezing, what does that mean about the plumbing? Probably going to have issues pretty quickly, would it not? Okay. Cameras, obviously recording what happened. This can act as a deterrent. Because let's face it, if you had the choice of walking into a lobby and stealing a server, and I'm not suggesting, I hate theft, but I'm saying, as an example, if someone were a criminal, okay, so we got a criminal here. Okay, I got the money. Okay. Are they going to go for the one with cameras or without cameras? Well, I'd have to be a pretty dumb criminal to prefer the one with cameras, wouldn't they? Okay. So, that's what we're talking about there. Now, I got a question for you all. Why did the zombie visit the emergency room? Okay, he felt rotten. Okay, had to visit the ER. So, a little bit about risk. Power management is a very important thing. So what I mean by power management is having an electrical system within your data center or wherever that is robust and not subject to a single point of failure. So, most servers have not one, but 2 power supplies. So they got redundant power supplies. Okay, and sometimes you may see more than 2, but in general, the idea is you plug this guy into one circuit, you plug this guy into a different circuit. Okay, and that's going to allow for a lot more redundancy. Because let's face it, do circuits have problems on occasion? Sure, especially ones that have a tremendous amount of power going through them pretty much all the time. Okay, so on top of that, maybe one of them is plugged into a local UPS, maybe the other is on a circuit that is powered via a diesel generator, for instance. You want to make sure that everything's redundant. Okay, backups. Have backups to your backups even. So let's say you had a diesel generator, and let's say there's a hurricane that rolls through. Okay. First of all, you'd want to stockpile diesel, would you not? Yeah, you would. Now, you want to store that appropriately. I'm not suggesting you just go out and get a big 50-gallon plastic drum and put it right next to your server. That's not a good idea for many reasons, okay? But, you want to stockpile, store things appropriately. So that's one talk about backup. But why not also have some solar panels in there, Have even another source of power. Now, what's the problem with solar panels in a hurricane? So for one thing, during the hurricane, obviously you're going to have a lot of cloud coverage. You're not going to be getting much, if any. But after the hurricane, let's face it, you got 100-mile-per-hour winds, you got 150-mile-per-hour gusts. Do you think those solar panels are still going to be on your building? I think it's very possible they'd be ripped off, would they not? Because in general, you're going to have a gap between the panel and your roof. And that gap could potentially be a way for the wind to get in between and rip it off. So I'm not saying one approach is better than another. But you want to have a disaster recovery. You want to think about how you would recover from a disaster. Have a business continuity plan that outlines what you would do in the event of pretty much everything you can imagine. So maybe the event of a fire. How do you recover from that? Maybe the event of an earthquake. How do you recover from that? Maybe, let's face it, what about a pandemic? If the government does not allow employees to enter a building, what do you do about that as a company? And again, I'm not here to debate whether that's something we should or shouldn't be doing, but let's face it, a lot of employees are not going to break the law to go to work, okay? If there's a foot of snow on the ground, I probably wouldn't go to work. Certainly wouldn't do it and get arrested. That'd just be silly, wouldn't it? But again, I'm not saying whether, I'm not debating the ethics of it. I'm just saying breaking the law, probably not going to happen with most people. Does that make sense? Okay, any questions about risk concepts? Okay, so some other things to consider, having recovery sites. So you have a hot site. Okay, a hot site is going to be one that has all the equipment you would need to sustain operations. And it also has everything pretty much installed on the equipment. You may need to do some minor updating, but in general, it should be pretty much ready to go. In contrast, you have a cold site. And a cold site is one that, to be honest, I don't see a huge value in. It's where you have an empty space that's available. So, in general, I would say, why do you have an empty space? It's like you got a big empty room. Imagine if there were just like a warehouse. And, hypothetically, you could go in there, you could get furniture, but in the event of an emergency, are you going to have the ability to procure, say, 50,000 desks? No. That's not going to be possible, is it? Okay? So I don't see a huge advantage to cold sites. Warm sites are going to have furniture and equipment, but they're not going to have everything installed. So if we're talking about furniture and a warm site, maybe it has furniture sitting there, but not being, fully installed. I don't know why you would have that, but anyway, that's what it is. And then it maybe have the technology, but it doesn't have anything loaded onto it. So no applications, possibly even no operating system. So that one would take a couple days to get up and going. A cold site, let's be honest, it doesn't matter what the disaster is. Okay? By the time you were able to procure the stuff, the disaster would be over. Okay? Most of the time. So I don't see a huge advantage to that. Have your own opinion, but let's say it's a hurricane. Okay, so in a hurricane, are you really able to get a lot of material shipped in? Not easily. Okay? So you want to keep that sort of stuff in mind. And I'm not saying you should have a redundant site. I think that's pretty costly. I think in 2021, what's a better approach? How about having stuff work from home? Okay, because if the issue is the earthquake tore up the roads, well then, no one's going to be able to go anywhere, are they? But they may still be able to work at home. Now, internet connectivity may be a different issue. There's lots of different considerations here. Does that make sense? So, I don't know of too many companies with a completely spare headquarters, for instance. Okay, you can make an argument about REI right now because they have a headquarters they're not using, but for the most part, these are more of a they're not really for an entire organization anyway. It's more of a data center concept, I should say. But even with a data center, I wouldn't consider it to be something you're not using. I would consider it to be something that's redundant and that you're using for stuff like load balancing. Does that make sense? I think that's a lot more logical approach to take. All right, so some different policies and procedures. The whole purpose of security policies are to outline everything you do. Patching, what software you allow, what software you don't allow, how you configure your image, how you configure user groups. Literally everything you can imagine as it relates to technology. Even stuff like what mail do you accept? I'm talking email, of course. Do you limit it by size? How do you scan the email? What's mail server do you use? Do you use cloud-based stuff? Tons of different things. It's all security policies. Okay. So you break all that down, and it could be hundreds of pages. Is that going to be fun to read? Okay, you started a company that have you read a 100-page book. Not a fun way to start. Probably not. Okay, you got security audits. So security audits, you obviously go through and you do basic auditing. You make sure that everything is as you expect it to be. Okay, we talked about clean desk policies last class. Talked about recording equipment. Talked about licensing. I think we talked about all this last class, didn't we? Pretty sure. Anyway, so just kind of wrapping things up. We covered firewalls, covered firewall technologies, a little bit about scanning, stuff like that, intrusion detection, as well as physical security. Any questions? All right, that's all I got. See you all Friday. Have a great day.